Currently, no mainstream media outlet is seriously contemplating the disintegration of the European collective. All major member states, Germany, France, Italy, Spain and Poland, clearly declare full support for the European Union, and the latest Eurobarometer readings indicate near-record public backing at 74%, a figure enthusiastically welcomed by the bloc's leader, Ursula von der Leyen. And yet, this apparent tranquility is merely a facade, masking the formidable challenges confronting Europe. As Josef Janink wrote in the German quarterly Internationale Politik, quote, "For the first time, the end of the EU is a realistic scenario. The foundations of integration are crumbling, and centrifugal forces are intensifying the process of disintegration." Unquote. Indeed, the fires smoldering or fully raging within the borders of the European quasi-empire necessitate stating the case plainly. The Union is sleepwalking toward collapse, and the symptoms of this phenomenon are visible everywhere today. The war on the eastern periphery is approaching its fourth year, and moreover it is permitting EU countries, which are falling victim to Russia's hybrid warfare. Economically, European industry is under a dual assault, simultaneously challenged by Chinese goods sold at dumping prices and by the aggressive tariff policies of Donald Trump administration. As it enters the AI era, Europe lacks virtually any large technology companies, and its capital market remains fragmented. These issues are clearly reflected in the economic heart of the continent, Germany, whose economy is struggling to find its footing in the new reality. To this, one must add persistent unresolved migration issues and exceptionally high energy costs, and this is only the beginning of the European plagues. That is why geopolitical rivals are already factoring the potential breakup of the Union into their calculations. Quote, "Whether the European Union will survive until 2035 remains an open question," states Chinese professor Zheng Weiwei. This in itself does not mean that the European Union is already on the brink of collapse, but the logical chain of cause and effect forces us to take that possibility seriously. Political forces are already gaining ground that blame the European project for the current situation, and not always with misguided arguments. Should these movements collectively come to power, they could very quickly consign the very idea of pan-European integration to the archives. Why, despite all this, does Europe still need the European Union? Why has the EU in recent years become a symbol not of success, but of paralysis? And what can the old continent do to once again become strong in its diversity? That is the focus of today's episode. Learning a new language is often slow and frustrating. Hours of memorizing random vocabulary and grammar rules that rarely translate into real conversations. Speakly was created to change that. The app uses a method that helps learners start speaking a new language up to 5 times faster than traditional approaches, by focusing only on the most practical words and phrases actually used in everyday situations. It also includes an AI language tutor, available 24/7, acting like a personal coach that answers questions, corrects mistakes, and guides learners step by step. On top of that, Speakly keeps the process engaging with listening exercises, writing tasks, and even music recommendations that make absorbing the language more natural. Most importantly, Speakly offers a lifetime plan, a single payment that gives users unlimited access to language learning forever. Try Speakly and check out the offer using the link in the description. In the mid-1980s, the British historian Paul Kennedy undertook a monumental challenge: to analyze and offer a kind of meta-synthesis of the forces that caused some great powers to rise and others to fall over the past 5 centuries. The result was his landmark book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, first published in 1987. In the very first chapter, Kennedy turns to Europe, as it was Europe that dominated most of the last 500 years of world history. Paradoxically, Kennedy notes at the outset that in the year 1500, even Europeans themselves would not have imagined that their continent would go on to dominate the world just a few centuries later. China and India towered over Europe demographically and enjoyed far superior geographic conditions for sustaining large, cohesive populations. The Yangtze, the Yellow River, the Ganges, and the Indus formed some of the most productive agricultural basins on Earth. Moreover, both the Chinese and the Arab world surpassed Europe in scientific and civilizational achievement. The mighty Ottoman Empire drew on this heritage and repeatedly drove deep into the heart of Europe, while ruling a territory larger than the Roman Empire at its peak. So why then did Europe, to put it simply, win? Kennedy offers several clues that turn out to be essential for understanding the condition of Europe today. The core driver of Europe's success, he argues, was, quote, dynamism propelled largely by economic and technological progress. And the first inherent feature of Europe that proved decisive for its future rise was, paradoxically, its supposed weakness, its political fragmentation. Quote, Europe was always politically fragmented, despite the efforts of the Romans, who failed to conquer the lands north of the Rhine and the Danube. The occasional larger power centers, such as Charlemagne's empire in the west or Kievan Rus in the east, were merely fleeting aberrations, whose end coincided with the death of a ruler, internal rebellion, or external invasion, Kennedy writes. This, of course, was the product of the old continent's geography. The abundance of natural barriers, mountains, rivers, marshes, forests, for centuries and even millennia, made it difficult to form a large, cohesive population centers seen in, for example, eastern China. Yet, as Kennedy notes, quote, this varied landscape encouraged the development and entrenchment of decentralized authority, with local kingdoms and marches leaving Europe's political map at any point after Rome's fall looking like a patchwork quilt, unquote. As a result, no empire in early modern Europe ever managed to subjugate the entire continent, and that absence of continental domination would become a crucial ingredient of Europe's future success. A second key advantage was Europe's favorable access to water. The continent, effectively a vast peninsula, is surrounded by seas and internally woven together by a large number of navigable rivers. The multiplicity of political entities, combined with unubiquitous access to waterways, fostered the expansion of trade, and eventually the rise of bills of exchange, credit systems, and international banking. This gave private merchants a degree of predictability, a rare commodity in that era. This largely unsupervised trade, combined with political decentralization, formed what Kennedy considers an extraordinary and transformative mix. Quote, this did not mean that the rise of market forces went unnoticed or unopposed. Feudal lords, wary of towns as centers of resistance and heavens of runaway serfs, often tried to restrict their privileges. What set Europe apart, however, was the absence of any unified authority capable of suppressing commercial development. There was no central government whose shifting priorities could dictate the rise or fall of an entire sector. Across Europe, there were always princes and local rulers willing to tolerate merchants and their interests even when everyone else was robbing or expelling them. Bankers, arms dealers, and craftsmen were not optional strata of society. They were essential ones. Sooner or later, most European regimes entered into a symbiotic relationship with the market economy, providing it with an orderly domestic framework and a non-arbitrary legal system, including for foreigners, and in return, receiving a share of the growing profits through taxation. Long before Adam Smith coined the phrase, rulers in parts of Western Europe understood that, quote, there is little required to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. Unquote. Decentralization and diversity were therefore not only fertile ground for the emergence of a proto-market economy, they also acted as a kind of insurance policy against its destruction. In highly centralized empires such as China, entire economic systems could be wiped out by a single imperial decree. Europe's fragmentation made that far less likely. The same applied in the military and imperial realm. No single power was strong enough to conquer a coalition of other states, which continually formed shifting alliances. Competition in weapons manufacturing, driven by this rivalry, allowed Europe to outpace its global competitors. And internally, this rivalry produced balance. Innovations spread quickly through a process of convergence, adapted by neighbors. All this played out within a market-driven system. Quote, "The free market system not only forced numerous condottieri to compete for contracts, but also encouraged craftsmen and inventors to improve their products in order to secure new orders." Unquote. Elsewhere, the pattern looked very different. Quote, "The Ming government of China claimed a monopoly on cannon, and the rulers of Russia, Japan, and Mughal India soon did the same. They had far fewer incentives to keep improving firearms once in power. Turning inward, the Chinese and Japanese neglected advances in military technology. Stimulated by a flourishing arms trade, Europe gained a decisive advantage over other civilizations and power centers." Unquote. Europe's arms race also revealed the need to finance risky ventures. Ventures that, if successful, could yield disproportionate returns. This is where 15th century European venture capital was born. Quote, "Genoese merchant houses were often prepared to finance Atlantic enterprises that might ultimately compensate them for the loss of Black Sea trade, while far to the north, in Newfoundland, cod fisheries were being methodically developed. All this reflected a constant openness to the wider world, something hard to find in other societies of the time." Unquote. In this way, Europeans not only discovered the new world, but were structurally prepared to capitalize on the opportunity, laying the foundations for modern globalization. The explosion of knowledge further strengthened Europe's technological and therefore military advantage. For other empires to reach this higher level, it would not have been enough to acquire European equipment or technology. It would have required wholesale borrowing of the cultural and systemic traits that distinguished Western societies from the rest of the world." Unquote. Across his sweeping synthesis of Europe's long arc, Kennedy returns again and again to the same set of concepts: decentralization, competition, risk-taking, diversity, and political fragmentation. The past few years have been an unforgiving lesson for Europe. A continent that believed defense no longer mattered was taught a lesson by Putin. A continent that elevated climate protection above everything else found few partners willing to match its ambitions. A continent that championed free trade had to confront Trump's tariffs. A continent that believed in globalization fell victim to collapsing supply chains. A continent that claimed a global political role proved almost powerless in Ukraine without the United States. This is how Nicolas Büsse opens his bleak essay in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, titled Europe's Self-Perpetuating Decline. Büsse argues that Europe, at best, will finish third, behind the US and China. At worst, the Union will unravel, and its members will fall into the spheres of influence of larger powers. But is Europe's decline truly inevitable? Here the answer is far from obvious. Just as Europe's earlier rise was never preordained, neither is its downfall. If Europe's success once emerged almost accidentally from the political geography that happened to provide fertile ground for the world's most effective institutional systems, today's success or failure depends far more directly on decisions made by political centers of power. That is why this episode asks a simple question: what is the EU doing right and should continue doing, and what is doing wrong and must urgently fix? The most common response from EU enthusiasts is a call to push forward. Many analysts, among them Janning mentioned earlier, and Roderick Keffer in a similar essay, locate the problem in the barriers slowing European integration. In their view, the EU needs a new integration impulse, something that could rekindle public enthusiasm for the pan-European project. The boldest version of this push-forward strategy is full federalization. If the EU is losing to larger, more consolidated powers, namely the United States and China, it must enforce deeper internal integration and build a level of unity comparable to that of its geopolitical rivals. This is the vision of the so-called United States of Europe. In December 2023, Mario Draghi, former president of the ECB, delivered his famous warning: Europe stands at a critical crossroads. To meet this moment, he argued, the Union must become one state. Quote, "Let's hope that those founding values that brought us together will hold us together. Today the growth model has dissolved, and we need to reinvent a way of growing. But to do this, we need to become a state." Unquote. Is this the simple cure for Europe's ailments? Federalization and a headlong leap into deeper integration? Scale, centralized decision-making, unified policies, the very attributes that define Washington and Beijing, are indeed very tempting. A fully unified Europe would immediately become a dominant economic bloc. In many areas, especially trade, it would surpass both the United States and China. On paper, the Excel spreadsheet of Mario Draghi must glow bright green. The combined economic potential of the Union is enormous, arguably still the greatest in the world. From the vantage point of an economist, the call for federalization seems perfectly logical. But that perspective, to put it gently, is very narrow. A nation is something far greater than the sum of capital flows. European nations have built their identities over centuries, in some cases millennia. Linguistically or culturally, a top-down push toward deeper unification, undertaken at a moment of mutual grievances and low trust, even if motivated by good intentions, risks producing not only limited benefit, but potentially enormous harm, the kind whose consequences are difficult to predict. It already has, in fact, when the idea of ever closer union was instrumentalized by nation-states to expand their own influence. One need only to recall Nord Stream, the supposedly purely business project. That the EU is not ready for federalization can be shown through a simple thought experiment. A nation, a population sharing a sense of common identity, can accept a situation in which richer regions transfer part of their surplus to poorer ones to equalize development across the whole. The clearest example is Germany. It is estimated that following reunification, West Germany transferred 1.6 to 2 trillion euros to the former East. And even so, productivity there still lags at roughly 75% of Western levels. One could argue that the EU has also engaged in such transfers through its cohesion policy, but the scale is incomparable. Poland, nominally the largest beneficiary over 20 years, received roughly 170 billion euros, while having more than twice the population of the former GDR. In real terms, the scale of EU transfers is more than 20 times smaller, and Poland's cumulative GDP over those 2 decades exceeded $10 trillion, meaning cohesion funds amounted to less than 2% of GDP. And cohesion funds represent only one side of the equation. Capital gains extracted by Western European firms from Eastern markets, the very markets receiving EU funds, far exceed the transfer coming from the EU budget. As Thomas Piketty notes, quote, "Between 2010 and 2016, Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic and Slovakia received EU funds equivalent to 2 to 4% of their GDP. Yet the outflow of capital leaving these countries over the same period amounted to 4 to nearly 8% of GDP. Will today's Dutch, German or Danish people enthusiastically agree to subsidize the poorest regions of Bulgaria, Romania or Poland? Transfers measured in the trillions of euros? Of course not. and it would be unfair to blame them for it. Just as it would be unfair to blame Poles, Romanians or Bulgarians for not wanting to surrender their agency and be structurally dominated by the West's biggest firms. This is the simplest definition of diverging interests. For years it remained a positive-sum game, but that model, for many reasons, is now running out of steam. Interests differ, and every player is pulling in its own direction. And so, if not federalization, then what? Everything suggests that something in Europe's machinery is no longer working as intended. And this is felt not only by economists or political scientists, but by ordinary citizens who experience the continent's problems firsthand, especially when comparing Europe's stagnation with a still dynamic Asia or the assertiveness of US policy. If we strip the debate of hidden agendas and look at the world as it is, we must acknowledge a basic truth. The EU is an association of nation-states whose primary goal remains the pursuit of national interests, even when this comes at the expense of the collective. The Union is not an end in itself. For EU capitals, it is a tool for building national strength. This may sound heretical to some, but once stated plainly, it becomes almost banal. It has always been this way. From its inception, the European project was not designed to eliminate national interests, but to channel them, to create a game that would be positive-sum rather than zero-sum, where every participant could walk away better off. And for decades, the EU succeeded. One can debate how effectively, but the basic premise that Europe was better off with the Union than without it is supported by evidence. But the world has changed dramatically. China, within 2 generations, grew from impoverished backwater to global powerhouse. Russia spent years preparing for a revision of borders and attempted to restore an imperial sphere. Meanwhile, the United States underwent a profound shift in strategic thinking. Brussels, however, mentally remained in a different era. Trade and technology transfers to China continued unabated, driven by short-term profit and short-term thinking. Western Europe dismissed repeated warning signs about Moscow's imperial ambitions and routinely ignored the concerns of the EU's eastern flank, culminating in Nord Stream, or German-French defense companies like Rheinmetall or Thales helping modernize Russia's military. Europe's approach to the United States was equally naive. Brussels assumed America would always defend Europe and safeguard its commercial interests abroad. Within just a few years, all these assumptions collapsed. Brussels woke up to a harsh reality. And on top of the self-inflicting errors came a series of crises: migration, technological stagnation, military weakness. Why did Europe fail so spectacularly? Following Kennedy's logic, partly because the EU, in its drive toward centralization, put all its eggs in one basket. The interests of bloc's strongest shareholders were elevated into the interests of Europe, even though Europe's political geography has always been naturally diverse. The result was the erosion of self-balancing mechanisms. A mistaken policy was no longer one region's problem. It was automatically exported to the entire continent. And so if we accept that trust is the highest binding currency in any community, and that building such trust takes decades if not centuries, then the conclusion is obvious. Talk of federalization is wildly premature. In fact, we are moving backward. The hidden use of EU structures to advance national interests, a fact not an accusation, at the expense of others, while talking about common values, only deepens mutual suspicion and erodes pan-European trust. It is a fact we can't simply ignore. No matter how compelling the vision of a United States of Europe may seem, it is neither feasible today nor risk-free. Pushing Europe toward federalization in the current climate, marked by mistrust, political friction, and diverging interests, could easily backfire and undermine the very strengths that European integration once delivered. Perhaps decades from now, a federation might become realistic if the EU invests in steadily deepening trust among its nations. but that is long-term horizon, not the present moment. So if we accept as an axiom that nations exist and must exist, because that is the immutable landscape of Europe, then the real question becomes, what do we do within that reality? Kennedy's entire narrative points to a simple truth. It was decentralization, political pluralism, and competition among dozens of kingdoms and city-states that created the conditions for Europe's historic rise. The EU, however, has drifted in the opposite direction, toward centralization and a single political line. Critics of integration seize on this as proof that the EU should be scrapped entirely, and Europe should return to pure nation-state rivalry. The problem is that we no longer live in the 16th century. The political systems born in Europe were later adapted, fully or partially, across nearly the entire developed world. And once larger nations and civilizations began using Europe's own institutional toolkit, their sheer scale gave them an advantage over Europe's many small fragmented states. The need for mass is therefore one of the foundational reasons the EU exists at all, and in today's world, that reason is more important than ever. Therefore, Europe stands in a structural split. It needs shared weight, yet its historic strength has always come from decentralization. In other words, Europe must operate within two boundaries at once. What does that mean? The continent needs centralization where absolutely necessary to defend itself collectively against larger powers, and decentralization and deregulation everywhere else, precisely the dynamic Kennedy identified as the engine of Europe's success. The EU should be a shield against aggressive US tariffs or a flood of zero-margin Chinese imports, and simultaneously an arena that fosters competition, experimentation, and diverse models of achieving competitiveness. In effect, it should echo the Europe of the 16th century, a landscape where different systems coexist and compete without imposing a universal template on every member state. If one country wants to pursue austerity and another embraces modern monetary theory, fine. If one bets on nuclear power and another on gas, so be it. If tax policy or welfare models differ widely, good. Systemic competition without enforced uniformity. That does mean Europe should abandon the EU? Quite the opposite. The Union remains a crucial European glue, and the data bear this out. A major new study on Brexit concludes, quote, Brexit had reduced UK GDP by 6 to 8%, with the impact accumulating gradually over time. We estimate that investment was reduced by between 12 to 18%, and employment by 3 to 4%, and productivity by 3 to 4%, unquote. Calling for the EU's abolition is therefore not just misguided. It is dangerous. So what should Europe preserve? What works? The borderless Schengen area is one of the EU's greatest achievements, a real, tangible driver of trust among nations. The customs union, in turn, shields European markets from predatory external competition, primarily from the US and China. Yes, trade policy creates friction inside the EU because member economies have different needs. But despite these tensions, the benefits of a unified commercial policy far outweigh the costs. The third element is less visible but no less important: common technical norms and industrial standards. This is not about stifling innovation, but about setting shared common layers that make it easier for firms to compete across all 27 markets. The simplest example is automotive safety and emissions standards. A manufacturer does not need 27 versions of the same car. One platform that meets EU-wide norms can be sold everywhere. This is a real structural advantage, an economy of scale that fragmented regulatory systems simply cannot produce. When we talk about a shield and a wall, it may seem obvious that the EU should also have a common security and defense policy. But recent years show how delicate, capital-intensive, and again trust-based this area is. Many nations, especially in the East, are unwilling to place their existential security in the hands of institutions whose interests, as they suspect, may diverge even slightly from their own. If we go deeper, we will find many other examples, but at the macro level, these are the core tools and attributes of Europe's shield and Europe's arena. This may sound old-fashioned, but examples of deeply rooted national rivalry across Europe are countless. Nord Stream served German national interests at the expense of other European countries and helped pave the way for war. Under the European AI Chips Act, the goal was a common semiconductor strategy, and yet every country scrambled to lure Intel and TSMC for itself. And then there are the major defense projects, a European missile shield that still doesn't exist, the SCAF 6th generation fighter, and the MGCS European tank. All of them are case studies in divergent national interests. Take SCAF. This joint program by France, Germany and Spain aims to develop a next-generation European air combat system, including a 6th generation fighter. Valued at up to 100 billion euros, its first pillar, the aircraft itself, is led by France's Dassault Aviation, with Airbus Defence and Space representing Germany and Spain. The program is now stuck in paralysis. France and Germany are locked in a battle over influence and control. Who decides? Who has the final say? How arbitration works? Dassault argues that its nominal leadership is meaningless without real autonomy, as the CEO of Dassault Aviation complains. Quote, "The question arises regarding the effectiveness of the project, which involves three countries, where there is no one real leader, but three co-co-cos. How can I have leadership when I'm facing someone who has twice the influence? How can we ensure project management if I do not have the right to choose subcontractors in France, Spain and Germany? I think this is not the right method to get an aircraft flying." Unquote. To which the Airbus CEO replied that if Dassault doesn't like the arrangement, quote, "they can simply leave the program." Unquote. The European tank project, MGCS, fares no better. After 8 years, it remains stuck in the concept phase. This means France still lacks a modern indigenous tank, while Germany is producing its Leopard 2A8. Therefore, some argue MGCS was effectively a trap to delay France's own tank program. Competition for Leopard. Accusations like this appear in virtually every major European initiative. Every nation wants to preserve its own advantages. It is as old as politics itself. But not every integrative idea should be dismissed. One area where deeper integration is both logical and necessary is Europe's capital market. European firms seeking to scale up routinely flee to the United States, because only there they can find the vast pools of financing required for a global growth. Among the world's 100 most valuable companies, only 10 are European, just 8 from the EU. Nearly 3 times as many are based in Asia. The United States dominates with 64. Many of these US giants are powered by European talent. Revolutionary startups are engines of innovation. They create entirely new industries and act as a long-term insurance policy for prosperity. Their concentration in one place guarantees this place remains on the frontier of global technology, and that is in the interest of every European. Add to this the capital effectively kept under the mattresses. Europeans hold 10 trillion euros in low-yield saving accounts, a staggering pool of idle money. Europeans are far less investment active than Americans, and European startups struggle to secure adequate financing. Here Europe needs several fixes. Which ones? First, a capital markets union. A genuine, integrated European capital market. What does that mean in practice? Harmonizing financial infrastructure. If a, let's say, Slovenian venture capital fund holds a EU license, it should be able to invest anywhere in the Union without layers of extra bureaucracy. If a Latvian startup wants funding from the Netherlands, it shouldn't need to complete 3 different legal compliance processes. If a Czech firm goes public, it should be able to list on an EU exchange with a single European passport. Europe would still have multiple exchanges, just as the US has New York Stock Exchange, Nasdaq, and Chicago, but the system would be far more fluid and scalable. Second, Europe must mobilize its own investors. If Europeans reached American levels of investment activity, it would inject at least 350 billion euros of fresh capital annually into the European market. And let's not forget, because of the structural advantages of US markets, many European investors prefer to put their savings into American startups and champions. A portion of that capital could return to Europe, especially as US companies are, on average, valued 25% higher than European ones. The EU is moving in this direction via its emerging Savings and Investment Union, but as usual, progress is slow. Then comes the endlessly repeated point, deregulation. One practical tool would be the EU-wide regulatory sandboxes, allowing young companies to test new technologies under relaxed rules instead of navigating 27 separate national regimes. Such steps would make Europe far more attractive to global talent, and could even lure back Europeans currently building companies in the US. A dedicated European tech talent visa would help as well, easing company formation and settlement inside the Union. Meanwhile, the reality is blunt. Americans openly mock Europe's approach to these issues. Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz is a prime example.
I can't help it. It's a little bit like the principle is just do the opposite of the EU.
Yeah.
Like basically, I think everything we've talked about so far is basically the opposite of the European approach.
Rivals from the other side of the world see it similarly. The Economist quotes Chinese consultants assessing Europe today. Quote, "Europe is a bit like an aging concubine who cannot accept that she has been ditched by her American emperor," says one consultant. "Europe hates innovation," says another. "This disdain can sometimes seep into official affairs. Europeans obsess over their competitiveness. In China, many see that as laughable. Europe simply lacks the strength to meet the challenges," says the article. The mere fact that both global competitors mock Europe so openly is revealing. The mockery isn't about a lack of potential. No one mocks Tajikistan, with all due respect. It is rooted in bad decisions and the waste of enormous existing capacity. What follows from all this is a return to Europe's default settings. Europe takes one step back to take two steps forward, shedding the illusion that Europeans can simply abandon centuries-old patterns of rivalry and national interest. That competition shaped early Europe into a uniquely capable and inventive cluster of states. But today, pure competition is no longer enough. European states individually are simply too small to generate the scale needed to compete with China or the United States. Hence, the European Union, its mass and combined weight, remains indispensable, though redefined and stripped of excessive centralist overreach. Schengen, the Customs Union, Common Technical Standards, and Capital Markets Union are the core mechanisms that form Europe's protective, quote, wall and its internal, quote, arena of competition. At the same time, nation-states must retain the freedom to pursue different development models. This diversifies the risk of error across many smaller units, exactly as early modern Europe once did. It also reflects the basic reality that each country's economic situation is fundamentally different, and therefore, each should have the flexibility to choose the policy mix that fits into circumstances. MMT for one, austerity for another. Brussels can still set broad trends, for example by proposing unified AI sandbox rules, but the actual competition for talent and venture capital should take place among states themselves. Think of it this way. Whether we make a personal life choice or a strategic decision affecting hundreds of millions of people, we are always trying to correctly estimate the consequences of our actions. The fewer variables we face, and the better we understand the situation, the smaller our blind spots. The evolution of the European Union is no different. But the complexity of the system makes unintended consequences almost inevitable. And this is precisely what we have seen in recent years. as Nicolas Busse observes in the Frankfurter Allgemeine. Quote, "The belief that the EU as a moral power could export its values to the world not only carried a whiff of neocolonialism, it also backfired. Efforts to enforce global child protection or climate norms harmed Europe's economy. Attempts to uphold an expansive right to asylum pushed many societies to the limits of their material and cultural resources. Trying to define security comprehensively led to defenselessness. The answer is not to further empower the EU, something reflexively demanded by those responsible for this outcome. The EU, above all, needs strong member states, economically and militarily." Unquote. Exactly. Europe's formula for success is both simple and extremely difficult. The EU is strong only when its member states, individually, are strong. By establishing clear and simple rules for internal competition, the arena, and external protection, the shield, nation-states can focus on winning without excessive, often counterproductive central steering from Brussels, which has become adept at producing grand strategies that ultimately go nowhere. Why do they go nowhere? Because these very strategies collapse the moment they collide with the national interests of individual states, each of which quite naturally pulls in its own direction. As we have repeatedly noted, this is neither surprising nor new. It is the structural reality of Europe. Polish economists writing in the respected Pulse of Business have voiced similar concerns. Their comments come in response to the sluggish implementation of Mario Draghi's much-discussed report on EU competitiveness. More than a year ago, Draghi laid out an ambitious reform plan meant to lift the EU out of its stagnation in productivity, innovation and ideas. Yet progress has been painfully slow. Of the 383 proposed reforms, only 11% have been fully implemented. 20% are partially in place, 46% remain in progress, and nearly 23% have not been touched at all. Analysts Gabriel Chrostowski and Ignacy Morawski view this as a structural problem. Chrostowski writes, quote, "This is a good example of a dysfunction within the EU that economists, experts and increasingly politicians point to: regulatory, cultural, tax and ideological fragmentation. This fragmentation means that attempts to pursue reforms at the EU level simply fall flat. This is why this process may need to be taken up from the bottom up by individual countries acting alone or in smaller groups." Morawski adds, quote, "There is no point trying to overcome this fragmentation, because such efforts lead only to negative reactions. The answer should be to give more competences back to the member states, while the EU focuses on a few critical areas, where consensus can actually be achieved." Unquote. Such a division of roles, an EU that acts as both a protective wall and an arena for internal competition, would accurately reflect what we already observe in practice. Today, however, the entire structure is covered by multiple layers of central strategies and national interests disguised beneath the rhetoric of a shared European good. This opacity damages trust, undermines collective interests, and ultimately weakens the Union. Transparency of this new chapter of the European project would help rebuild trust. Recognizing both the domain of competition and the need to build a common mass could lead to mutual acknowledgement and respect for divergent national interests, while creating more opportunities to reconcile them. A unified capital market, for its part, could offer a chance to build genuinely European brands. Today, Mercedes is German and Renault is French. Yet to a Texan or a Delaware resident, Tesla is simply American. European founders have to think beyond national identity from the very beginning if they want their product to be seen as truly European. Only then it is possible to take off the national lenses and cultivate a European consumer perception necessary to scale across a market of 450 million people. This, however, requires a coherent developmental and marketing strategy, for example, locating different parts of a business in different member states. Narratively, the argument is straightforward, yet the European Union remains locked in a state of inertia, in which undertaking any decisive action requires a monumental effort. Still, in a spirit of optimism, it is worth remembering that Europe already possesses the single most important asset, one that gives it a chance to climb out of its current misery: the people. Europeans remain highly educated and continue to want to build and create extraordinary things. The problem is that the current EU ecosystem, often for reasons that are not immediately obvious, makes this difficult for them. Brussels, as well as every European state in its own way, must find ways to unlock this potential. Imposing rigid, centralized frameworks does not help. If that happens, blue-chip firms like ASML, undeniably exceptional, would no longer be outliers. There is even a faint light at the end of the tunnel. The share of European unicorns, companies valued at over $1 billion, has increased by 5%, reaching 23%, the highest level in decade. Startups offer a perfect illustration of a universal truth in any developmental process, whether economic, technological, or political. One variable matters above all others: the number of iterations. Progress comes at making an attempt, assessing the outcome, and adjusting. Attempt, result, correction, on repeat. A decentralized, democratic capitalist system creates perhaps the ideal conditions for shortening this loop and accelerating it. The European Union seems to have intervened in this loop so heavily that its gears have ground to a halt. Instead of many autonomous iterative cycles, it has created one giant wheel that turns more slowly and absorbs far less feedback. Do the themes raised here capture the full scope of the changes Europe needs? Certainly not. But adopting accurate, reality-based starting assumptions helps reduce the system's inertia and its vulnerability to shocks. Europe must come to terms with what it is, and then calmly work toward improvement, both collectively and at the level of individual states. One step back to make two steps forward. Perhaps this way of thinking is beginning to break into the political mainstream. A telling example is a recent interview with Friedrich Merz, the leader of Europe's largest country, Germany, a country which for many years had been one of the strongest advocates of deeper integration. Quote, "I never believed in the idea of United States of Europe. It created false associations with the US, and it was far too centralist in its approach." He continues, "This method of integration has reached its limit with 27 member states. Now cooperation between governments is far more important. That is why I am advocating closer cooperation, for example with France, Poland, Italy, and the countries of Northern Europe. A great deal is now happening thanks to this intergovernmental approach, for example in Europe's response to the war in Ukraine." Unquote. If Merz and other pro-European politicians stumble or adapt too slowly to the new reality, the warnings from Chinese analysts that the European Union could disintegrate by 2035 may turn out to be prophetic. And that would be a dark day for Europe.